Today, we're diving into a discussion on a controversial and dark topic within the 3HO with our esteemed returning guest.
I'm Stacey Stukin. I'm a Los Angeles-based journalist.
Hi, I'm Philip Deslippe. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
In this episode, we'll delve into their comprehensive investigative work on the abuse within the 3HO organization and its associated boarding schools. Please be advised that this episode discusses various forms of abuse, including physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, which may be distressing for some listeners. Therefore, listener discretion is advised.
I'm Stacey Stukin. I have been reporting on 3HO for many years as a yoga journalist. I've also been working with my co-author, Philip Deslippe, for several years on a series of investigative pieces about 3HO, the most recent one about the boarding schools that the children were sent to in India.
Hi, I'm Philip Deslippe. I research and write on Asian metaphysical and marginal religious traditions in modern America. I first wrote about 3HO back in 2012 for a journal called Reparations. And for the last 4 years, I have continued to write on 3HO. And I've done a series of investigative pieces with Stacey for the Wire Service Religion News Service and for Canada's Boz News.
Thank you, both of you, obviously, for doing this again. This is the second time that I've had the pleasure to host both of you. And obviously the first time that we spoke was in relation to Yogi Bhajan and more so focusing on him and his legacy in 3HO. And this is obviously focusing more on the boarding schools per se. But one thing that just caught my attention as you were both talking, which is that you've both been working for years on this particular topic and you've done a number of investigative pieces. The curiosity in me has got the better of me and just kind of wants to know what goes into researching and the kind of the evidence collecting and the kind of analysis. Like, what is that process like?
Well, it's a rigorous process whereby we speak to a lot of people. I think for this piece, we spoke to about 50 people several times. And it's a lot of corroborating stories. It's a lot of looking at documents, court filings, 3HO periodicals. And it's also building a group of sources that we have spoken to over the years who we have, cultivating their trust.
I know in the last discussion that we had, we focused extensively on Yogi Bhajan, but just for those who may not have listened to that, I know we can't perhaps condense him into a nutshell, but just to kind of give us an overview of him as an individual and of 3HO, what is going on there and how would you describe him and his institution?
Our second to most recent piece for Boz, How Siri Singh Sahib Yogi Bhajan Created an Empire, I think is a great singular read for people to understand the whole structure of 3HO and how it was created and how it worked. But to put it in that nutshell, in late 1968, a former customs officer from Palam Airport in Delhi, Harbhajan Singh Puri, comes to the United States by way of Canada, and he starts teaching what he claims is an ancient, powerful, previously secret form of yoga called Kundalini Yoga. And he fits the expectation of these eager, hippie spiritual seekers in Los Angeles at the time. And so very quickly, this yoga that he's teaching, which we know is kind of like a hodgepodge of various other yoga styles that he picked up over the years, these eager hippies take to his yoga. He sends them out across the country to establish ashrams and yoga schools. And he quickly builds this network of students. And in late 1970, he goes to India, and there's this dramatic upheaval where he has a break from one of his teachers, and he suddenly starts claiming to not be a yoga teacher, but to be a Sikh missionary. So he pulls off this kind of stunning coup during an election year where he presents his hippie students as Sikh converts, goes all the way to the Harimandir Sahib. And then, as we discuss in our piece, when he comes back to the United States in a little bit of time, he uses his after the fact claims to receiving a title to create this very particular form of corporation known as a corporation soul. So he establishes his form of Sikhi with the state of California. He claims this title of Siri Singh Sahib, and that creates this infrastructure that allows him singular control over the assets of his students, their property, their inheritances, their donations. So he really becomes this head of an empire, a worldly empire, while claiming religious authority. So that allows him to amass all kinds of resources. Also during this time, as he's claiming to be a Sikh religious authority, his students start converting very rapidly to Sikhi. So 3HO in the mid-70s becomes this really strange amalgam of yoga, New Age teachings, and a kind of form of Sikhi with Yogi Bhajan as the head of it, as the leader. He also claims to be like this singular tantric master, a yoga master, the head of Sikhs in the Western Hemisphere. So this is the form of 3HO. His students create businesses, they kind of fall under his control, and this continues throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and until his death in 2004. What is also going on, and there are, rumors of it, there are allegations in print from the very beginning, Yogi Bhajan is not only exploiting his students financially and spiritually and psychologically, he is also physically and sexually abusing dozens of his female followers from the beginning all the way through up until his death. So that is, in a nutshell, who Yogi Bhajan is and what his Healthy, Happy, Holy organization, or 3HO, is comprised of.
Two things. For anyone listening who wants to understand more of that, I would suggest go and read the Bars piece, and we'll obviously include it in the comments below, but equally you can go and watch the previous podcast. But secondly, you mentioned that the corporation was a sole corporation. Now, it sounds like that's a particular type of entity, and I'm assuming it's obviously very specific to the US because we don't quite have the same thing here. So, like, what is that?
But you do.
Oh, okay. So please explain.
The royal family is probably the most well-known corporation soul. So the word soul, S-O-L-E, means singular. So a corporation soul allows some holder of a particular title to have singular control over an entity. So a bishop in a Catholic diocese controls the money, the schools, the churches, everything within a diocese. When that bishop dies or is replaced, there's not the usual kind of changing of the guard or inheritance. It is whoever takes that place as the holder of the title just goes into that role and then controls the assets on their own. So when the Queen of England dies and the head of the royal family is now the king, there's no real transfer or loss or inheritance or dispute. It just seamlessly moves over. So that's what a corporation soul is. In the United States, you need to have a religion and a religious title to have that kind of corporation and have that kind of one-person control over the entities. And that's what Yogi Bhajan has.
So in the US, you just need those two things and you can set that up.
As Stacey and I discovered, you can do a whole lot of things if you're a religion in the United States. You have really extraordinary powers and an extraordinary lack of checks and balances against religious institutions.
Is that partly why we see so many, I know this is massively off tangent, but is this also partly why we see so many mega churches and just like crazy amounts of wealth just being accumulated by these institutions that then just seem to spend it all on themselves and just living the best lives?
Yes. As one legal scholar told us, it may not be ethical, but it's legal.
Mad. Wow. Okay. I didn't realize that Corporation Soul was also a thing in the UK. So I'm assuming it's something that exists in the West, or is it just?
I don't know.
Okay. No,
Then,
fair.
yeah, we know it's in England. We know it's in the United States.
Wow.
But I think the other significant thing is not only do religions have legal power and legal rights, they also have a lot of social power. Americans are very hesitant to poke at any established religion. There is a sense in the United States that people's religion is their own business, and the government shouldn't interfere in churches. So there's also just a great kind of informal hesitancy to go after religious institutions.
Fair. I can't remember I know, I'm sure one of you will remember, but the infamous incident where the US send the troops into that cult, that's a church, and the building ends up being set on fire, and everyone in it, I can't remember what the name of it was. It was in a documentary on Netflix.
The Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas.
Yes, Waco, that's it. Yeah. So, as in, that is very much, I guess, an example for why the US is perhaps in certain instances not necessarily up for interfering with religion. But just coming back, also on topic, with these boarding schools, then, from reading the Bars article, they were set up in the 1980s. What was it perhaps at this point that facilitated this being a kind of this idea almost being allowed to materialize? Obviously he doesn't set them up as soon as he starts teaching yoga, and it comes a little bit later on. What leads to then him establishing them, and why? I know it might sound silly to some people listening, but why in India and not perhaps in the US?
Well, the boarding schools were a culmination of practices that started early on in the community. As Philip explained previously, his followers began living in ashrams, and Yogi Bhajan also arranged their marriages. So as they started having children, Yogi Bhajan described these children as, saints, sages, and little yogis who were destined to lead humanity. But he also told his followers that they were too neurotic and ill-equipped to raise them properly. So this began a child-rearing experiment, or that's how some of our sources described it. A child-rearing experiment gone horribly wrong. And the philosophy was called distance therapy. And so he began separating children from their parents. And sometimes these kids were toddlers as young as 17 months old, and they were sent to live with other families, across the country, far away from their families of origin. And this led to years of separation of parents and children. And then eventually, as you note, they did take it a step further to send children to India. And this happened in 1981. The first group of kids went overseas. And this came from the feeling that not only are the parents too screwed up to raise the children, American society is too corrupt and materialistic. It's full of violence, drugs, and sex. And let's send our children to, the spiritual homeland near Amritsar so they can live, in the home of Sikhi. But, you also have to understand that the children were raised to believe that Yogi Bhajan had more power than even their parents. He was the spiritual authority, the temporal authority. So his requests or beliefs were supreme. So if he's saying, go to school in India, you, as a child, one of our sources described it as martyr culture. You went because you knew you were doing something for the betterment of the community, and also for the betterment of, the Khalsa community.
It's very interesting when you go to Yogi Bhajan's lectures and 3HO periodicals in the 70s and early 80s. We can talk about boarding schools and other people raising children. But when you go to these primary sources, there are very strong ideas within 3HO that explain this push. Yogi Bhajan talked about the coming insanity, that not only is American society corrupt and violent and filled with sex and drugs, but it's going to collapse. Like pretty soon, Americans are going to go crazy. Civilization is going to collapse. There's also a belief in 3HO, as I can imagine, as offensive as it might be to your Sikh listeners, that 3HO Sikh converts they're destined to fulfill Sikh history. There's an apocryphal tale about Guru Gobind Singh and the pipal tree is going to grow and there's going to be, 96 million Sikhs. 3HO believes they are the branches of the pipal tree. There is writing where they say the gurus didn't spread Sikhi outside the subcontinent. It was left to us. We are the ones who are going to spread it throughout the globe. We are going to be the healers and the saints of, the new age. So as crazy as this might seem to outsiders, within 3HO, there's a very real sense the stakes are that high. Like the future saviors of humanity, the future Sikh Jedi Knights are going to have to go through this because, humanity and the future of the Dharma depends on it.
Just on your point about Yogi Bhajan making a point about the coming insanity and the collapse of civilization and all that like crazy jazz, wouldn't it be fair to say that that's kind of intrinsic to any cult? Because like you need an end point almost to kind of like you almost need that to hinge everything else around. Otherwise it doesn't quite hold the same gravity. As in, if you're like, well, actually all existence is just a circle and we end up coming back round and round and round, like wanting to then save the universe doesn't quite hold the same weight. Or like, is the use of the end of days perhaps like used in different ways to that?
I mean, I think there's always a sense in 3HO that the clock is ticking. There's always something around the corner. Yogi Bhajan is always talking about like, I can die at any time. I don't have much time left. There's a comet, or there's an oil crisis, or there's enemies outside the group. There's always something around the corner.
I mean, there's also built into the yoga practice meditations to, survive nuclear fallout, to, earthquakes. If you're going to freak out, that's a term that they use because it's a very 70s term. So if you're freaking out, do this meditation. So yes, there's a lot of things aren't right. Yeah. And, by sticking with us, you're going to be safe and you can ride it out.
There's the whole walking to Espanola, New Mexico thing of, drastic, awful things are going to happen. And, several first generation followers of Yogi Bhajan we talked to said that they had very concrete, real plans to walk to Espanola, New Mexico, because number one, it would be the only and a safe haven. And two, things would be so bad that you couldn't even drive there. Certainly not going to fly there. We're going to have to walk there. And that is the rhetoric within the group in the mid-70s.
Just on that rhetoric, has that existed post Yogi Bhajan's demise then? I can't imagine it has. Or has that become, I don't know, has that narrative almost taken a life of its own, or has that died alongside Yogi Bhajan in terms of reinforcing that kind of same concept?
The way I see it, it's taken on another form. It's not like dire, the world is ending, but it's like we are living in challenging times. Life is very stressful. Parenthood has many challenges. Kind of taking on the mantle of wellness culture that kind of exploits people's vulnerabilities of, everyday stressors that we're all experiencing. But they take it a step further and present, the yoga as a cure-all for, anything that may ail you, whether it be, physically, mentally, or emotionally.
So they've changed from meditations for nuclear fallouts for meditations for economic like crashes. Then I guess like they've just changed it to be more contextually relevant to the environment, which is interesting.
A little more slick, right? A little more pretty real on social media, looking, meditating, and kind of focusing on the physical benefits of it. And also, it's also a capitalistic enterprise.
Yeah, I think a lot of those very kind of outlandish, far out things, they absolutely shaped 3HO in the early 70s onward, but kind of like the embarrassing outfits you had in your college days, a lot of them are kind of removed. They're not going to put out in public their polemics against Punjabi Sikhs or the predictions that Comet Kohoutek is going to destroy America. They're going to push those to the back. But I think that's still shaped in a much deeper sense their view towards other Sikhs, their view towards their own yoga, their own view of self-importance.
It's really interesting. Every time we have these conversations, there's more that I want to ask you off the back of what we've discussed than actually is listed. But coming back to the questions, we were talking about the boarding schools, and you described that how the first group of people were sent off in 1981. I just want to get more of an idea of what were the conditions like, what was the educational environment like, and how was the treatment for the kids like? Because I remember as a child growing up, and I think it still exists, there's a place in India called Baru Sahib, and it was literally used as a threat against me if I didn't behave at school, that I'd be sent there to do my GCSEs and my A-levels, and I genuinely was scared shitless. That was the last thing I wanted to do. And yeah, there's a lot and hence the parallels. Like, what are the conditions like? And I can't imagine they're going to be the nicest of places.
So I think succinctly, what are the conditions like? Terrible. But just to kind of be a little more specific, there are a series of boarding schools that children in 3HO are sent to. So prior to 1981, there's this kind of distance therapy where children are sent to be raised by other families. There are children's ashrams where there's a lot of children and a few caretakers. And there are a few kind of test cases that go to boarding schools in India prior to 1981. But that's when in bulk, in large groups, children start to go there. So in 1981, the children are sent to this school called GNFC, Guru Nanak 5th Centenary School in Missouri. And this is someone else's school. So 3HO children are kind of segregated. They have different uniforms, different practices. They're kind of like a school within a school. There seems to be some conflict there. So from 1989 to about 1993, 3HO children then go to another school in Dehradun called Guru Ramdas Academy. And this seems to be a boarding school that's run by someone sympathetic to Yogi Bhajan. So it is that kind of school within a school. They have their own kind of thing, but it's a little more integrated. Something happens there at GRD Academy. And then in the early 90s, there's several transitional years while 3HO is constructing its own school in Amritsar. So this is Miri Puri Academy, which still exists today. So it opens in about 1996, and it's open until the present. MPA is built on land that is owned by the SGPC. So this land is kind of given to 3HO in a sweetheart lease. We've heard from several people, $1 for 99 years. So MPA currently sits on land owned by the SGPC. So while there are these different schools that are run in different ways, one kind of constant theme is that the conditions are awful. There is a whole host of mistreatment, abuse, and neglect that the dozens and dozens of survivors we spoke to talked about. So the food is not good. There's not enough food. There's improper medical care. There's abusive staff. Children are abused in a whole host of ways: corporal punishment, isolation, physical abuse, mental, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. There is substandard education. There is a lack of preparation for college or careers. There's a sense that you're just going to work for the Dharma. You're going to work for 3HO anyways. So it's a whole host of really awful things that happen to these children. As part of our reporting, we spoke to people who are connected to kind of well-respected, well-established boarding schools in India, international boarding schools. And these schools are built upon large financial endowments. And there is vigorous fundraising. There is qualified staff that works for them, staff that has experience, college degrees, and training. This is not the case at any of the 3HO boarding schools. There is like a severe lack of resources. There are unclean, unsanitary environments. So there's a host of things that could go wrong. And kind of one of the horrible ironies is that 3HO parents they're paying a premium for this awful these awful conditions. You know, they are paying a lot of money to the 3HO foreign education department. And, you know, I think we did some kind of back of the envelope calculations, and it would have been the equivalent of sending their kids to an actually decent private school in the United States. But instead, they're sending them to the living hells in India.
One question I have off that, and you kind of answered it in what you were saying in terms of how it, in many ways, a lot of these students, it was kind of like, these children, it was kind of like, well, you're going to work for the 3HO anyway. Is the objective of these places being so crappy that, or is there more to it? Like, as in, I guess what I'm trying to wrap my head around is why were they purposefully so bad? Like, what was the end result for them, or what was it that, like, well, I guess the money was obviously the first thing that they benefited from, because it's obvious that it's not going to these these institutions, but like, what's the objective from 3HO's point of view?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one, the kids are in an environment where, in addition to crappy academic, they are, however, being trained in yoga. So part of your, graduating credential is the yoga teaching credential. And it also, continued to separate the parents from the children. So it maintained the kind of control issues of the organization. And what was the second part of that question? I'm sorry. I also think because it was on SGPC land, it also gave 3HO, a stake in Amritsar. So there was like kind of a visual, physical representation of, the Goral Six. I mean, we also heard from children who attended the schools that they were kind of paraded around the countryside to do kirtan and gatka. So they were kind of this representation of, what 3HO Sikkim was.
And in some way, it's a direct parallel to Yogi Bhajan's first trip to India in the late 70s, early 1971. What's he doing with his hippie students? He's parading them around the countryside, dressing them up in Sikh costume and having them perform kirtan to, astonished rural folk in the Pind who are blown away by seeing these young Americans singing kirtan. It's not that different. Many people talk to us about the boarding schools being a kind of PR.
And were these boarding schools only open to to children of 3HO, as in like someone in India couldn't send their child to it, or someone who wasn't part of 3HO couldn't send their child to it?
The first two boarding schools, GNFC and GRD, they are mixed, especially GNFC. It is an Indian boarding school where 3HO sent their children. Miri Piri is much more controlled by 3HO, designed by 3HO, but they are still taking in students who are willing to go and pay admission into the school.
I interviewed a couple of students at Mary Perry whose parents were not involved with 3HO. They somehow they weren't Americans. I think they were from Mexico, but they somehow had heard about the school and they wanted to go, and their parents sent them. So there was, I think that was a minority of students, but there were other students that were not from 3HO families at the school, and may still.
Oh, okay, no, fair. Does the Media Academy still take students on then if it's still open, and like has it improved in any of it? Like as in like what is the current state of the institution?
Well, the institution went and talked to us. Had made several requests for interviews. From what we know from public-facing social media and their website, they're very much still in business as a boarding school. It did close a bit during the pandemic, as many boarding schools did, but they're back in business, and they do have students there, and you can see the students performing Seva at the Golden Temple. You can see them practicing yoga on the Instagram reels, and the website indicates that it's, up and ready for education in Amritsar.
Yeah, I think one important thing that came through in our reporting and talking to dozens and dozens of people, in a way, it's kind of like a parallel to the abuse that Yogi Bhajan perpetuated. There was a kind of a mistaken sense among many people that the abuse was isolated, or Yogi Bhajan's abuse somehow developed or got worse over time. But actually, he's abusive from the very beginning. There's, I think, a similar misperception with the boarding schools that somehow they were bad, but then they got better over time. And I think one of the reasons for that is that some of the most outspoken activists exposing the abuse and mistreatment in the schools, they themselves went in the 80s and early 90s. But in talking to people, there was a systemic, ongoing, institutionalized culture of abuse all the way up to the closing and the pandemic. In some ways, the abuse and the mistreatment and the neglect changed, but you also start to have this revolving door in the late 90s where people who grew up in an abusive environment come back to be the caretakers and the managers at the schools. And so this kind of locks in the culture of abuse. Well, this is what we do. This is good for people. This is just what happens. You don't really have qualified outside experts or trained staff who come in, but you have people who this is just what we do. I have no better credential than Yogi Bhajan says I should be doing this, and that's enough. So the idea that the schools got better over time, we heard stories and testimonies of hazing and bullying and abuse all the way up into, 2020 in the closing of the pandemic. So I think, the sense that, well, that was something in the past that got fixed, we're better now. I think that's, in many ways, that's relying on PR and a promotion more than the testimony of survivors.
How then did the allegations of abuse and what was actually going on in these institutions and these schools come to light at first?
Well, for over 15 years, there was a woman who had a blog called Rishi Nods, and she was documenting the abuse that she and her peers suffered at the Indian boarding schools. And actually, it's a really good resource if you're interested in learning a little more about that. But there really wasn't a public reckoning until 2020, when I wrote a piece for Los Angeles Magazine as there was a memoir published by a former high-ranking 3HO official about her illicit abusive affair with Yogi Bhajan. And after the publication of that book, a lot of other women came forward, as Philip mentioned, to report abuse they suffered at the hands of Yogi Bhajan. And there was an investigation, and it revealed that Yogi Bhajan, more likely than not, committed acts of rape, sexual assault, sexual battery, harassment. Simultaneously, this is when the second generation was able to also come forward and tell their stories. In particular, there's a man named Sahej Khalsa. He was born in the 3HO. He attended the boarding schools in India. And at the time, he was on the Siri Singh Software Corporation, which is the overseeing body of 3HO. So he wanted to give his peers an opportunity to tell their stories. So he scheduled a 45-minute agenda item on a Zoom call, and it's in the middle of the pandemic. And, tens, if not hundreds of people got on this call, and an agenda item slated for 45 minutes went on for 12 hours. And this is, adults telling their stories of harm, trauma, and abuse growing up in the community with their parents and their peers watching on. So as you can imagine, this was a very intense, emotional, upsetting, course of events. And from there, it led to a lot of hard conversations within families, within communities. And a lot of people said, this was the first time we were actually heard, and that we were heard, that and acknowledged that what we experienced was abuse. It wasn't just, just the course of growing up, that these were actually really terrible things that happened to us. But, I should also note that for a long time, the abuse was kind of hiding in plain sight. Think about it. Parents would pick up their children from the airport. They'd have lice. They'd lost tons of weight. They were filthy. In many ways, these parents were kind of, ignoring their very basic instincts to protect their children. We had spoken to women who said, it was really hard for them to suppress their maternal instincts, but that's what they were told to do. A first-generation man said to us, well, once you allow somebody to arrange your marriage, then you kind of lose control over your life. And also it was kind of baked into the philosophy because, Yogi Bhajan told them the kids were going to complain. So, don't worry about it. That's just the way it's going to be. And, the headline of the piece, 3HO boarding schools were a living hell. That came from a quote directly from Yogi Bhajan. And he basically said they were designed to be a living hell so that, we could produce independent, strong individuals with grit that could survive anything.
I think it's also worth noting, these people, because they left, kind of fly under the radar. But over the decades, there were people who left 3HO because they either said, I'm absolutely not going to send my own child away, or they saw the abuses at the boarding schools or at the hands of Yogi Bhajan and left because of it. So it's not to say that everyone, it's a very complicated situation, but not everyone is really, anchored to the organization. There were people who left. There were people who didn't allow it to happen or sent their children to schools in the U.S.
Off the back of that then, in 2022, I think as a result of what you were just talking about, there was a compensation and non-monetary reparation scheme that was kind of instigated. How it's obviously faced criticisms for being underfunded and actually just re-traumatizing a lot of the survivors, with many requests just not even being fulfilled. How has that gone on? Like, has that achieved what it set out to? But secondly, and I think perhaps more importantly, what has been the emotional and psychological support for all of these survivors? Because it seems as though, like, I know some of the requests are non-monetary, and I'm sure it would fall under what I've just mentioned. But it seems like these people have been through literally living hell, and then have just been left to kind of deal with it essentially. And just from listening to what you guys are telling me, I can feel the heaviness myself. So I can only fathom to imagine how the people who have gone through this feel. So yeah, what has 3HO done to try to help in any manner then?
So I think the first thing to kind of wrap our heads around is, what is a reparations program? These types of programs they're a new animal. There isn't a lot of precedent for them. I think the easiest way to understand what they are is they are like an agreement reached between two parties that is then enforceable by a court. So, Mar, if you're going to sell your car, we can write up a contract, and the contract doesn't mean anything unless it's notarized, it becomes official, and then it's enforceable by the court. So these are private agreements that are reached by both sides. In theory, the benefit of a kind of reparations program is that for survivors, they do not have to go through a lengthy and re-traumatizing process in court. They don't have to wait for years. They don't have to be examined on a witness stand. Also, a reparations program potentially offers some kind of settlement to people who might not legally have a case. The type of abuse they suffered may not have violated the law, or they might not have enough evidence or clear memory to win a court case, but in a reparations program, they can still receive something. That's the upside in theory. For an organization that is facing all of these accusations of abuse, it allows them to settle a large number of claims without having to go to trial, without having to be compelled to show evidence, without members having to give testimony under oath. So it allows them to, blunt terms, get rid of the problem relatively cheaply without having to go under the examining eye of the legal process. They don't have to show documentation. People don't have to go on the witness stand and talk about what they knew and when they knew it. There's in a lot of these programs, there's a kind of trauma-informed language where that's what's offered to survivors, that you don't have to be re-traumatized by a court case. And this is what is presented to survivors of 3HO. When this independent healing and reparations program is presented to them, it's presented as a trauma-informed process that did not have any caps or limits to it, that would be administered independently, and that would, in addition to monetary settlements, allow for non-monetary changes. And from the people that we spoke to, this ran a whole gamut. Some people wanted apologies from abusers. Some people wanted physical items back that they lost. Many people wanted institutional changes and safeguarding, background checks, some kind of oversight on children who were sent to schools. What happens through this reparations program, in many ways, as one of the lawyers that we spoke to said, it was a bait and switch. Survivors were told that it would be trauma informed, but instead it's re-traumatizing. There ends up being a limit on the monetary settlements, and as far as we know, little if any of the non-monetary settlements, those kinds of safeguardings, were ever instituted. And for people to receive their monetary settlement, they have to sign away their rights to ever sue the organization in the future. And I mean, several of the experts that we talked to said in the United States, many states are rolling back their statutes of limitation on cases of child abuse and sexual abuse. So states like California and New York, I believe Maryland, suddenly rolled that back. So if you were abused in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, suddenly you have a case again. And very few politicians would ever want to stand in opposition to that kind of legislation. Are you going to say, like, on the floor of, your state Congress, these abused people had enough time? So from a very kind of practical standpoint, I think any savvy lawyer or any head of an organization would look out into the horizon and realize there's a real possibility that states can roll back these statutes of limitation, and they could be facing massive lawsuits and court cases in the future. With 3HO, you have a California corporation with headquarters in New Mexico, a foreign education office in Oregon, and children who are coming from Massachusetts, Virginia, Florida, Texas. So any one of those states could be a legitimate venue for a lawsuit. A very cynical way to look at the reparations program is that 3HO eliminated the number of potential lawsuits that they would get, either by people signing away their rights or just being exhausted by the process, from hundreds and hundreds down to maybe, a few dozen. It was from that standpoint, it was a very effective process for the organization.
And described by many who participated as yet another form of abuse.
And just to clarify, it sounds as though no one would ever end up in prison by the current situation, like reparations. It just seems like there doesn't seem to be any type of legal justice involved in this. It's very much like we enforce an agreement and that's it.
There are 2 civil lawsuits that we know of. So there are people who did not want. One group is a cohort who went in, who declined the reparation and filed a lawsuit. It's a personal injury lawsuit, and it's centered more around the sexual abuse they suffered from Yogi Bhajan. Another woman who filed a lawsuit back in 2020 that's just, taking a very long time. It's the organization that's a lot of lawyers, and there's a lot of stalling, and it's very hard to determine assets. And so it's a big ordeal to take on this organization. So as Philip stated, in many ways, a reparation program can, make that process easier and more streamlined, but it's not necessarily more beneficial in the end.
Yeah, the lawsuit that Stacey just mentioned, this woman, Sunny Khalsa, following that suit, as it's been slowly moving through the courts, as we are aware of all of the legal battles that 3HO went through in the 80s and 90s, it's straight out of the 3HO playbook. Stall, slow down, try to wear out the people who are suing you. And that's what happens in the 80s and 90s. That's why Yogi Bhajan never had a day in court. Is the tactic was always to throw the resources of the organization against anyone who would oppose it. And when all else fails, just settle out of court.
To your point that, there's no law enforcement or criminal charges. I mean, that is partly because of the organization's, unwillingness to ever go outside. There were times when, people knew about child abuse going on and they were mandatory reporters and they did not go to law enforcement. Think internally, there was the feeling that the real, as somebody quoted to us in the story, the sin was going outside the organization. Yogi Bhajan would counsel people, both regional therapists, even parents were hesitant to go outside if there was something going on with their child. Everything was very insular.
This is a question that is it wasn't on the list or anything, but it's got my curiosity, because one thing that I don't know whether it's just a British perception of America, but America is very heavy when it comes to justice. And it seems as though, like, in this case, I'm almost scratching my head as to why there hasn't been more of a kind of a push against the 3HO. And the only reason I mention that is because I was watching a documentary on another cult, which I'm sure you've heard of, called NXIVM or some shit. And again, very similar situation in terms of the charges that, or the allegations and the charges that are brought against this cult. And in the end, RICO charges are pressed against the whole organization for sex trafficking, forced labor, and extortion, amongst other things. Now, some of those things we've discussed in the last podcast in terms of that occurring under Yogi Bhajan's leadership. Why then is there not the same response? Like, what is it about Yogi Bhajan that seems to, or this institution that allows it to have continued and almost reset itself? As in, it doesn't seem like, as in, it's got the same allegations against it, but it seems to have survived it. Whereas other cults and other organizations have faced this, been taken down by RICO charges or other justice, and have fallen apart.
I think that's the big question. And, in our piece, you have that quote from Sahej where he says, these are people who defend child molesters. And I think that's, one of the starkest and most kind of glaring features about this group. We know that there are many abusers of children within the group that have been well known from the rank and file all the way up to the top, and no one did anything. I think that speaks volumes on the nature of an organization where they are willing to defend that kind of abuse of their own children and children within the community. It's really indefensible and inexplicable. And as you said, I think, charges that were brought against NXIVM could absolutely be brought against 3HO. Maybe, I don't know if specific RICO charges, but there were people who were mandatory reporters who did not report. I think part of it is that, when you look at so many of the parents and community members, you almost have this like really bizarre paralysis. So much of what was going on was in plain sight, yet no one did anything, even knowing that the abuse was going on. You have people who are picking up their children from the airport, as Stacey mentioned. Children who had lost weight, were filthy, who had lice, children who had told of abuse, and no one does anything. No one, to use the Indian British phrase, no one does the needful. No one goes to the police. No one reports it. And, as, the two people that we mentioned by name in the piece, one of them, Narayan, just continues to live in the same home in Phoenix for decades. The other abuser, Kirbal Singh in Espanola, he's part of the community. He's trotted out to an interfaith gathering with, I think, the governor of New Mexico. It's astonishing. And it's even more astonishing when you put it next to all the things that 3HO6 claim to be, and pride themselves on being, spiritual warriors, saints and sages of the Aquarian age, very intuitive people, practicing the all-powerful yoga of awareness, and just to go on.
I will probably cut this bit out, but I think for me, coming back then to actually the podcast, you obviously spoke about how the reparations program is a bait and switch, and I assume that is causing a lot of friction and frustration with the individuals who are trying to go through that process. What type of challenges are they facing when they're trying to seek compensation or reparations? And if it's failing, where does that leave them? Like, is there anything else they can do, or is that the end of the road?
Well, the reparations program is closed. It has been completed. They're still waiting to see if any of the non-monetary requests will be honored, but we feel like, or we've been told rather, that there's not a lot of hope that would happen. There have been no public statements of any systemic changes or safeguards that have been put in place. There was one of the independent administrators that was hired by the reparations program, which was, paid for by 3HO, a man named Ian Elliott, who has been tasked with compiling a report of all the harms that had been reported through the reparations program. And he was to anonymize it and publish it publicly so the community could see everything, that all the harm that those who applied for reparations suffered, that has yet to be released or materialized. And at the same time, Mr. Ian Elliott has also been strangely contracted by Mary Perry Academy to do some consultation and perhaps recommend some changes. But again, there has been no public statement whether that has happened or if any of those recommendations have been made or enacted. So it kind of seems like everything's back to business as usual. I mean, Philip and I are just, watching Yogi Bhajan's face, name, and likeness being continually, put back on websites, put back on yoga courses. There was a time where, after 2020, where people, made these public apologies and acknowledgments, and now the organization is controlled by people who still revere Yogi Bhajan and have forced out anybody who was progressive or who wanted to make positive change to protect either people doing the yoga, the children in the schools, or in any other 3HL affiliated organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two levels to it. I mean, so 3HO is structured, no surprise given its history, it's structured in a very top-down way. So the people who are at the top, who are on the Serious Things Hub Corp board, they populate the other boards. They control the tenor of the organization. So when people described as hardliners and fanatics won the most recent election, it's no surprise that they're going to clean house and that they are to, put their own people in these boards, that they are going to be uncompromising. That's been the history of 3HO is, to purge dissent and purge outsiders. One person described it to me as, it's like North Korea, it's like any dictatorship where, one of the most important things is, did you bow to the portrait of dear leader? Did you bring enough flowers to the memorial? And that's a question for people who are up for jobs at many of these entities, or their contracts come up. That's an actual interview question. What is your relationship to Yogi Bhajan and the teachings? How do you feel about dear leader? So, I mean, in some sense, it's not a surprise that, any kind of dissent or kind of progressive people will be purged out. I think one of the more shocking things is that, as Stacey mentioned, the people who a few years ago, had their public statements, or crying their tears or wringing their hands, I believe the victims, they're back. They're back. They're leading teacher training. Come to my Kundalini yoga workshop. They've fallen back in line, whether it's because they don't know how to do anything else, or the money is there, selling the yoga to the public, or whether they really like the charge they get from sitting on a bench and telling people what to do. Even the people who seem to be, many of the people who seem to be progressive and who seem to feel very badly about what happened, they're back in line. I mean, kind of astonishingly, you have people promoting Kundalini yoga to heal trauma. The yoga that traumatized others can heal your own trauma. It's stranger than fiction in many ways.
Well, no, and I would say, back to, the adults who grew up in this organization. I mean, it's heartbreaking. They went through this process with a sense of hope, a sense that, the institution might acknowledge their harm, but there may be change. I mean, there was various requests. I mean, there's like the shut it down crowd to the reform crowd. Everybody had their own, requests. But, in the end, there's a lot of really re-traumatized, upset adults who, have lost their community, maybe lost connection to their family, having to, leave jobs or businesses that they've built from, early stages and having to reinvent themselves. And it's very disheartening to see, and that's all I can say. It's upsetting.
I think an obvious question that a lot of people have, and I've heard this from many people have said this in conversations with us, is why would you even go through the organization? Why would you go through a reparations process? Why wouldn't you just sue them? Why wouldn't you just go after them in a court of law? And I think that's very reasonable, and certainly people have done that. But I think in addition to the difficulties in suing the organization or a class action lawsuit, many of those difficulties we already talked about, I think on a deeper level, I think for many survivors and second generation adults, I've heard this directly and many of them indirectly, I think there was a hope, however misguided, to give their parents, their caretakers, and their community members one last chance to apologize and be decent and make good on things. I think from what many people told us, despite the money or lack of money on the table, many of them just wanted truth and reconciliation. Do a report. Tell us what the hell happened. Apologize. Understand what you did. Understand the horrible thing that you created. And, for the most part, the people who were responsible for building 3HO, who were responsible for building the system of neglect and abuse, they completely failed to be adults and face up to what they created. And, what many people told us, within the first generation, there was just the default of, oh, I didn't know. Well, I suffered too. Well, that's negative. We're just going to move forward.
Well, I was going to say the easy default is to, blame it on Yogi Bhajan. But as we discovered, as we have been discovering in our reporting, and particularly in this piece, it's an institutional problem. It's systemic abuse. You cannot lay this at the hands of just one person.
Yeah, I mean, as one person bluntly told me, if you took all of the enablers and the helpers and the associates away, you would have an overweight man belching and yelling from a platform. You could not have had 3HO, and you could have not had the abuse without all of these people falling in line, supporting it, encouraging it, giving their expertise to allowing it to happen. There were so many failures along the way. It's a way out, I feel, personally, to say, I was in a cult. He was controlling everything. I was brainwashed. What could I do? A lot of people left. A lot of people tried to stand up to it. A lot of people tried to blow a whistle. It feels very, very weak to say, I couldn't have known, or it's not my fault, or it was that guy in the framed portrait. It was all his fault. Yeah, I mean, and that's the other thing too. I mean, if you want to talk about enablers, Let's talk about the SGPC and the Caltucket and all these high-ranking people for decades who supported Yogi Bhajan. And his portrait still is in the Central Sikh Museum in Amritsar. And, the SGPC also declined comment. You literally could not have Miri Piri without the SGPC land. How many deaths occurred on MPA's campus? 2, 3 deaths. Published accounts of abuse, all sorts of things, and nothing.
There's two things. One is that I can't wrap my head around the lack of legal attention to what the hell is going on in India and in the US. And I'm assuming there are people in high places that are helping to ensure that this doesn't occur. And again, this is just speculation. But secondly, from what you are both saying, there seems to be a complete lack of accountability and a complete lack of just change or reform. So as dire as this may sound, it seems like they're just setting themselves up for this to happen all over again. Like, I can't wrap my head around what is their longing. Like, this just sounds, as you're saying, back to square one, back to what it was prior to the memoir being published and kind of everything, the doors being open, so to speak. What is going on with 3HO then at the moment? Like, surely you would want to reform and change and be like, all right, we've dealt with this horrendous situation, but actually they're saying, well, we kind of dealt with it. No, psych, let's go back to what we were doing.
I mean, this will probably ensure that I'll never go on a vacation in North Korea, but one person described it as North Korea. They told me if 3HO dwindled down to 5 true believers in a trailer in New Mexico who did their daily yoga and had the portrait of dear leader Yogi Bhajan, that would still work. That it really is about hardliners and true believers and, respecting and honoring whatever it is that they've built. I mean, a good comparison that I always refer to is the Kripalu Institute in Massachusetts. The yoga guru who headed up Kripalu, he was outed for having sexual and abusive relationships with women. Kripalu cleaned house. They reinvented themselves. They distanced themselves from him, and they remade themselves into kind of an all-purpose retreat center. They realized, well, at the end of the day, we all want to still promote a healthy lifestyle, yoga, meditation, vegetarian cooking, and they survived. Not only did they survived with some kind of integrity intact, some kind of example of, you could admit wrongdoing and move forward in a way. 3HO doesn't have that.
Well, it's also because they don't, I think there were many in the second generation who were in the organization who could have pulled that off, what Philip just described, but they were also alienated and kicked out and not given an opportunity to carry on the organization as they saw fit.
One of the things that Stacey and I often say to each other is, a compromised institution compromises people. And I think that also makes it very difficult that, people in environments of abuse abused each other. There's a lot of people with a guilty conscience or are embarrassed or horrified about what they knew and what they didn't do. So there's a lot to get through, or there would have been a lot to get through for people to get to a point where they could face what had happened and make the necessary steps to correct it. It's a lot easier to just move on. And I think that was kind of built into the cake. With Yogi Bhajan and his followers, there were all these seeds that were planted of, people who speak out. They're weak, they're in their ego, saints are always slandered, people who can't handle it leave. Yogi Bhajan saying and parents reifying and believing that it's a good thing that these schools are awful and abusive.
Crazy. I just don't, as in, it's...
To wrap your head around, I understand.
Yeah. it's such an insane situation, and there's so many threads that in like the cult of personality is so overpowering that people, like you're saying, it's like a North Korea. If there were 5 people still left and a picture, they'd continue the cult on the end of a cliff or something, hanging over like some precipice. And at the same time, then people, going back to what we were discussing earlier, people are also almost using that as a scapegoat of accountability, because it's like, oh yeah, it's him. It was him, and it was the cult, and now he's dead. It's all okay. But actually, that's not the situation. Talking about the lack of systemic changes, or considering what you guys were saying earlier, that it's back to square one, have 3HO tried to do anything to come to terms with what happened?
Well, there were, in between the reparations and the initial revelations in 2020, there were all kinds of consultants brought in for truth and reconciliation. There were, what were they called? Listening tours.
Compassionate reconciliation.
But like, this just sounds like bollocks. Like, as I don't mean to be rude, but it just sounds like utter bollocks. Like what? Like, as in, if someone laid a finger on me, the last thing I want to do is have a discussion with you. I actually want to see you face some type of justice, not like have a listening party. Like, I don't, like, as in, I guess the question off the back of that is also, what was it about the institution that, like, I don't quite understand how so many people would agree to that type of resolution to something that is that heinous.
One of the things that Stacey and I found again and again is that it is very easy for untethered language about trauma and spirit and all of peace and all these things to be used and to be weaponized. It's very easy to describe yourself as heart-centered and trauma-informed and lead people through a process that is not rigorous or grounded or doing anything real.
I just want to share that it's just as baffling to us as it is to you. Because, how do I say this? So we had a hard time even getting parents to talk to us for this story. It was very difficult for them to face the accountability and the harm that happened to their children. And the ones that did, we're grateful for that. But at the same time, we wish there were more.
A lot of credit to Eva Karkalsa, who Stacey interviewed and said on the record, it was wrong. And it's something that's so simple, but she was the only one out of many, many attempts who was willing to come forward and admit it and say it was wrong. I'm sorry.
And be accountable. Yeah.
And be accountable in a public facing venue. And I think it goes both ways. It speaks a lot to her, but it also speaks a lot to all the others who wouldn't or didn't.
Do you think, and this is me being like really cynical, I guess, but do you think, it seems like from my assumption, 3HR are almost planning to just let this die out? And I mean that in a literal sense, because if we're talking second generation, well, then the first generation must be getting on a little bit. It can't be long before they're not here. Like, second generation is going to take maybe a few more decades, and by that point 3HR would have spent that time doing all their PR and pushing their money into wherever they need to kind of rehabilitate themselves. What do you think the 3HO game plan is, considering they don't seem to have done anything? And secondly, in an ideal world, what do you wish they would do in order to resolve the situation? So I guess one is literally, what are they doing? And the other one is, what could they do to actually help what they...
You might be shocked by this, but despite practicing the yoga of complete health and awareness, the first gen of 3HO are just aging and dying off like normal people. We already see that with, I don't think a month goes by without at least one first gen member of 3HO succumbing to, very normal and very human ailments. So I think that is very true. I think the first generation is rapidly aging and dying off. It's hard to imagine any kind of robust future when the first generation is dying off. So many of the second generation and others are leaving 3HO. They're either joining with local Punjabi Sikh Sangats, or they're changing their names. They're reinventing themselves outside of the group. So it's hard to see the numbers remaining even stable, despite their missionary efforts in Russia or South America or elsewhere. I think that's with the 3HO6. You have 7 3HO6 in Chile taking Amrit, and you have some kind of sort of 3HO Nahung guys in Russia or whatever. But, the number of those 3HO Sikhs is dwindling. There's probably more of a future in the yoga because people have no problem selling the made up yoga of a serial rapist to do all sorts of things.
The second generation have plenty of suggestions. In fact, they initiated a petition on change.org, which kind of outlined a lot of those recommendations. And, the priority was to create safeguards so children will not be harmed, transparency within the organization, apologies for harm done, and, general, and a report, a full accounting so people can, have a public document to actually see what happened.
And 3HO are just basically saying that's not they're not agreeing to enact on any of those suggestions.
As far as we know, there have been no public indication that that's happened, and they also declined to speak with us.
Yeah. Would you be surprised if they did enact some of those suggestions?
I would be. I don't think, in the aggregate, I don't think there's any indication that the first generation or the leadership of 3HO have the will or the strength or the integrity to make the risks or be uncomfortable in the way that they would need to have that kind of transparency or accounting. I think it's far more easier for them to continue to deny, to continue to move forward, and to not address what had happened. And I mean, when we say what happened, there were almost 600 reparations claims, 600 people who suffered various, and in many cases, multiple forms of abuse, and were compelled to write out what happened to them and apply for reparations. People that Stacey and I talked to said, because so many men and women who grew up in 3HO, they're off the grid. They were in prison. They're suffering from addiction. They committed suicide. So if you had those people were able to be tracked down, if you had people who could file claims on behalf of their deceased or lost relatives, you're looking at probably around 1,000 claims. That's massive. Also, just like the percentages of it, 3HO was never that big. So if you're looking at 600 or 1,000 claims from the people who grew up in 3HO, that is a massive percentage of the total. That's systemic. That's not exceptions. That's not bad luck. People who happen to grow up in this ashram instead of that ashram. That means it's systemic. It's throughout the organization.
And that doesn't take into the account the sufferings adults still experience, complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, long-term health issues due to the lack of medical care they received as children, sleep disorders, loss of connection with their families who are still involved in the organization, hard time having healthy relationships. So there's a lot of, surviving the abuse means more than just actually surviving the physical.
I mean, the people that we've spoken to who, forgive the air quotes, who are okay, they're just barely okay. They're able to be okay because of a lot of hard work, of a lot of effort, a lot of therapy, and things kind of breaking right. A family that's able to help support them, or the ability to go to college, or a really supportive partner. I mean, if we just do the rough kind of accounting of the settlements that people received versus, what people would realistically need to rebuild their lives and to move on, it's a vast gulf. A lot of the settlements, roughly speaking, and the people weren't allowed until the end to talk about amounts. You're looking at like maybe a few tens of thousands of dollars. You can pay off a car loan, pay off a credit card, maybe go on a vacation. What a lot of these survivors could have gotten, should have been, could have been, the amount of money that would have allowed them to go back to college, learn a new career, not have to work for a while, have therapy for the rest of their lives, have the ability to take time off from a job. I think, when you do the math of it, for those 500-600 people to have received those kinds of reparations, it would have meant shutting down 3HO and selling off the businesses and selling off properties. But that wasn't the choice that was made. Instead, it was taking a chunk of money from the businesses and then doling those small amounts out.
I also like to note that one of the biggest businesses is Yogi Tea. So if the listeners are consumers of Yogi Tea, might want to know that is a 3HO company.
Yeah, there is so much more that I would want to ask off the base of everything that we've discussed. I think we've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I just want to double check with both of you. Is there anything that you want to include or mention, or any kind of final comments before we wrap up?
I think you're going to provide links to our pieces for Boz. If people want to go further and get more into depth, those two articles are great places to start. If you want to know more about what the second generation of 3HO experienced, the blog Rishi Knots is a great resource with testimonies and photographs and descriptions and details.
No, fine. Thank you. I can only say thank you both for your time. It's been almost like 2 hours, and as always, you've both been absolutely brilliant. So yeah, thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you. It's nice to see you.
Next week on June 8th, we're joined by Sunny Singh, author of A Bollywood State of Mind. Sunny's book offers a captivating look into Bollywood's cultural impact and its role in shaping societal norms. We'll explore the evolution of Indian cinema, iconic films, and the stars who brought them to life. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss this engaging discussion on Bollywood's magic and its significance beyond the screen. Otherwise than that, see you next time.